All right, before we get started today, I want to invite all our listeners, please hit that subscription button and hit that notification bell so that you always are up to date with the content we're putting out here at Catholic Studies Academy. And please help us out and help our community out by sharing the content so that we can help each other, our friends, our family, so we can help each other grow in our Catholic faith. Thanks and God bless. Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith and Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli. And on this special podcast, we're going to be celebrating in a little way our 100th episode. And so whenever you reach a milestone, right, it's always good to think back where you've come from, think about where you're going, and, really count your blessings in between. And so in this episode, we want to offer you some of our advice with regards to going back to the basics, looking at the Catholic faith and looking at some of the good guides that are out there that can help guide you in your Catholic faith. Because we want to talk about this because it really strikes at the heart of why Catholic Studies Academy exists. This topic, it touches the core of our mission here at CSA. Since in 2018, the good doctors and I, we really saw a gap in education, right? There was this gap between good, solid parish catechesis and very expensive undergraduate degrees. And even in good parish catechesis, there was a lot of good things out there in theology, and they were thematic and topical, and they did well at addressing certain issues and things like that. But one of the things that we wanted to really try to do was to offer a systematic study of philosophy and theology. And so there were really three things that we sought out to remedy. The first was the understanding that philosophy serves theology, right? And this is why the church has asked for these two things to be studied in connection. And so it's important for us to study the faith. John Paul II said in Fides Oratio, right? Philosophical thought is often the only ground for understanding and dialogue with those who do not share our faith. Well, that's a lot of people today that exist that do not share our faith, right? And so we wanted to really put the study of philosophy and theology at the service of evangelization. The second thing we wanted to do is like I said, we need a systematic study of both faith and philosophy because this builds an ordered intellect, right? I know in my own training, after school, after going to school and receiving degrees in theology, I'm still going back and putting things in order, with the help of philosophy and with the further study of theology. And the third, this really brings us to the topic of our podcast today. And that is, we knew from the very beginning, from our own experience of growing in our own Catholic faith and our own areas of expertise and how we became experts in those areas, was that in order to really grow deeper, in order to really make progress, we need good guides. I mean, that's with absolutely anything. That's not even unique to theology and philosophy. And so Dr. Smith and Bulzacchelli, thanks. Congratulations on episode 100.
All right.
And I think it's something very exciting, something we should celebrate. And I think, to begin, let's go back to the basics here with regards to faith, right? So how do you understand faith to begin to really sort of cooperate with God's grace in this way? And, why is it important?
So in the book of Hebrews, we have kind of a working definition of the word faith, right? The word pistis in Greek, as used in the Judeo-Christian tradition at that time and going forward, right? Which is that it's the substrate of that for which we hope, right? The substrate of our hopes, and certainty concerning those things which remain unseen. So that's kind of a basic starting point for a definition. Where do I take that? Well, it seems to me that faith gives us a kind of knowledge, right, that we don't have through natural reason alone. that's inaccessible to us by natural reason alone. And I don't think that it's reducible to just facts about God and about the things that he does, although those things are indeed known to us in many instances only by faith and in no other way. But I think that what faith really is, right, is that faith is really the knowledge of who God is and where we stand with him, right? So it's basically, it's God's self-revelation received by us.
Mhm.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
I believe God. I believe
Sure.
God.
Sure. Yeah. 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 I think that's right on, Rich. And I would just kind of echo that approach and line of thought when I talk about this some in different contexts. I emphasize the idea that faith has an object, and that object is God's revelation, right? And so you're talking about sort of God's own revelation. So, one of the things I always bring up about this is, it's kind of like the question with an obvious answer, but it's really important. It's kind of like, people when they might ask, well, why should I be a philosopher? Why should I study philosophy? And I always like, well, do you love wisdom or foolishness? Right. Right.
Foolishness.
That's right. And then
Ignorance is bliss.
when you think about faith and theology and knowing God, you think, okay, this is knowing God, right? Faith is, if you want to get to know somebody, a really great way to get to know them is to listen to what they have to say about themselves, right?
Yeah. To start by believing me.
That's right.
Then we might get someplace in our relationship.
Right.
I mean, really, this is the
Absolutely.
major thing, right?
Mhm.
If the end goal here is to have a relationship with God, a relationship of friendship and of sonship
Sure.
with God, then it begins with my believing him.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Listening to him. And this is the thing, sometimes, you get this language, and I'm glad you introduced this, Rich, that you get this language of relationship with God. Sometimes Christians will espouse it, but they don't study scripture. They don't study doctrine. They don't study tradition. And you're like, well, what kind of relationship do you have? Right. It starts to sound like it's probably a monologue, right? Because instead of like a real friendship, a real getting to know someone, right? If you're gonna get to know someone and understand that person or trinity of persons in this case, right, you have to listen, right? You have to hear them. And where we hear God, certainly, we can think about hearing God in the liturgy and in private prayer, but we hear God in Scripture, right? That's where He speaks, right? We hear God in sacred tradition, right? So that I would say one of the glories of faith, right? Just to kind of wrap up here, is that we get, it is the primary way in which we get to know our God. Right. And if that's important, if knowing God, our ultimate end, is important, then, you need to cultivate your faith. It needs to not just be an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would add to that also, not just, it should be in that first order, right? To know God, but also like to know who you are. Like, I mean, I think for at least the modern man, right? Because usually he's already denied God, but in some way he wants to understand himself better.
At least,
Well, yeah, I mean, well, if you want to, if I want to understand how my Toyota works, I go to the manufacturer, I go to the one who built it, and okay, what's the design? How did you build this thing? How does it operate to its fullest extent?
Sure.
And how does it flourish as a car, right? In a similar way, right? We need to, in order for us to understand how we were created and how we are going to flourish as human beings, well, it's probably important to understand the one who designed you, right? The divine manufacturer.
Which doesn't the Second Vatican Council speak to that in some way?
So basically, this is a big theme in late 20th century theology, right? And it continues to be a theme. It really was a strong theme in the thought of John Paul II as well. So this is the idea that that God reveals man to himself.
Yeah,
right?
Gaudium et Spes, right?
Gaudium et Spes, yeah. And John Paul II quoted that passage often.
Sure.
So the And basically, right, he says that it's really in the incarnation above all other places where the revelation of man to man is made. So, and that makes a lot of sense if you think about Christ. If you think about like the purpose of the incarnation, above and beyond the need to redeem man from sin, right? But the very idea that God chooses the vehicle of becoming a human being in order to do this. If God becomes a human being, right, then you might want to pay attention to the kind of human being he is. And right, and what does it look like to be that man? What is a man supposed to be?
Yeah, that sort of strikes the sort of the imitation of Christ sort of note, right? In the tradition, coming myself from a kind of Thomist Augustinian perspective, one of the things that I think about, of course, with respect to the incarnation, especially, is man realizing that he is a sinner and that he needs salvation, and a salvation that he can't provide for himself, right? And so, one of the things that certainly the incarnation reveals to us, right, is our own sort of brokenness, our own need of grace, and as say our even when we are redeemed, that we're still dependent upon a redeemer, right? Dependent on someone sort of outside of ourselves, and that's not something that's very comfortable to the natural man, fallen or otherwise, right? That we need somebody outside of ourselves, right, to save ourselves.
Yeah, that points to the necessity of faith, right? I mean, that should be huge for Christians, right? It's necessary, right?
That's right.
Without like you said, without faith, it is impossible to please God, right? That's
if you think about the logic of this, right? So let's, I mean, this saying from Scripture, strikes the contemporary person as a little bit, I don't know, divine narcissism or something, right?
Right.
But
Old
think about it like this, right? If God makes us for friendship with himself, if that's the thing that he made human beings to be happy with, to be satisfied with, right? To bring us to our fulfillment, then the process of our lives is a process in which God leads us to himself. Now, the question is obvious. How am I supposed to find my way to God if I don't believe him when he tells me, walk this way, come here? It seems to me that it is indeed impossible to find our way there on our own. We can't climb to God by ourselves.
Yeah, that's important. That's very important, Rich. I mean, that's again, that strikes at kind of the pride, and even sort of, I mean, amongst my the philosophers that I respect and admire, there is I think in the kind of pre-Christian world, say in the Platonic tradition, maybe sometimes a tendency to kind of think, well, at least a few of us, right, can ascend to the one, right, and transcend our humanity or our apparent humanity through just the right combination of asceticism and contemplation. I think about someone like Plotinus, right? Maybe not the many, but at least the few, right, are capable of kind of climbing their way up, right, to the one, instead of being sort of lifted up through the life of grace and faith.
Yeah, so this life of faith, the beginning of eternal life, as the Catechism says, right? It's bringing us there, and but the nice thing is that we're not the first ones on this journey. There are those who have gone before us, right?
Absolutely.
The witnesses of faith that we look to, and I think as we said in the beginning, right, it's important to look to those witnesses, to not discount things of the past as just simply old and antiquated, but to look for the wisdom that's within them, to look for what did they do because they had it so right, and I think for us each in our own area of discipline, whether it be catechetics, philosophy, or theology, right, there have been those that we've looked to that have made a great impact on not just our study, but I think, or at least I'm talking personally here, but I mean, on our own faith life, on our own journey towards eternity, right? So Dr. Bulzacchelli, why don't you get us started with this round? Point to maybe one or two theologians, saints that have really had an impact on your own faith life and maybe your own study of the Catholic theology.
So I mean, my own personal story is a fairly long and twisted one. I mean, twisted in the it winds in various. So
a whole nother podcast.
The truth comes out.
It's so, and I can go back to when I was in high school, and my primary exposure to scripture came, such were the conditions of the time, through Jimmy Swaggart, right?
Mm-hmm.
The televangelist. And he wasn't, I would say he wasn't a particularly good guide, but he was someone who, at the time that I really needed this kind of thing, went to the scriptures as a place of authority and proclaimed what he believed them to say with confidence with the idea that it was life-changing. And that was important to me at the time. I'm not going to credit Jimmy Swaggart as one of my great theological influences, but it was actually an important moment in my development. Sure. that period of time. And then really on the basis of his influence in thinking that scripture was something I needed to read, I picked up the Gospel of John, and I just read it very, very carefully.
About how old were you then?
I was probably about 17.
Okay.
And I read it very, very carefully. I don't think I really understood it all that well, but I read it carefully enough that it seared itself into my mind. Mm-hmm. And from that point forward in my life, it has been the touchstone for me in scripture. This is one of the reasons why later I gravitated so heavily toward Joseph Ratzinger, because of all the gospels, John is his gospel, right? Mm-hmm. So, but along the way, right, I went to college, and that was sort of a miracle in itself, but that I got into college, because I was a terrible student in high school. But when I was in college, I had, for various reasons, thought I might want to major in philosophy, and I did. I very quickly made that decision. Back then, you didn't have to go in with a decision, right? They didn't really expect you to make a final decision until you were like going into junior year. Mm-hmm. But I made the decision to major in philosophy by Thanksgiving break of my freshman year. Mm-hmm. And I was exposed to people like Plato and Aristotle, and Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas. And these were all really pivotal figures to me. Not, of course, I was exposed to many more people than that, even within specifically the Christian tradition. But these were really the pivotal figures for me at the time. I was really in need of what Thomas had to give, which was sort of a systematic and rational way of approaching the faith. Mm-hmm. I needed the faith at the time to sort of answer questions about the world that I was exposed to, the natural world, not just sort of to answer questions in some, I don't know how to put this. In many ways, I was a contemporary human being. I mean, I was the modern man, in that I don't think I approached the faith already as something to be believed on the basis of its own authority, but I saw it as one explanation needing to be justified
Mhm.
in the world. And Thomas, more than most others, helps to provide that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I mean, I know many times, like even in my own like reversion to the back to the Catholic faith, kind of, because I never really left it, but I was just very nominal. But you know, I was kind of tired of kind of one-off answers.
Uh,
I wanted to gain a much larger perspective. Give me an answer that also makes sense with all the other answers I've been given.
yeah.
You know?
Why is this the case?
Yeah, and
Why
not
is it
just in
not the other thing?
yeah, and not just in this particular situation, but in the overall picture, the big picture. How does it coincide with what does morality have to do with the person of Jesus Christ? Like, you know, questions like that. Where I think the kind of the integrity. I wanted the integrity of the faith to show, right?
Mhm.
Um, so
Yeah, that it
rats.
hangs together, that
Yeah,
it
yeah.
it makes sense as a totality. That's what Thomas provided me at that time in my life. I mean, later I've moved away from Thomas to some significant degree, but
Mhm.
um, in the direction of Ratzinger and people like that. But at the foundation, I mean, Thomas was definitely my most significant influence in my early days.
Sure. All right, Dr. Smith, how about you?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, pretty much very similar to what Rich has say. I am a convert. I came into the Catholic faith during college, um, and I think maybe I knew zero Catholics personally. So I was one of those nerdy guys who just read a lot of books and kind of was like, "Hey, man, this sounds like it's true." But very early on in that experience, there were a number of there were just all kinds of different components that go into that. I wouldn't say, some people when they say, when they who come in kind of that route, kind of think of it as primarily argumentative, and I would
Yeah.
certainly say arguments and apologetics had something to do with it, um, for sure. That was, I would say, a component, uh, an important component, but only one component among others. Certainly the beauty of the liturgy, the beauty of the Catholic faith, I think, was a very moving aspect of it,
Mm.
as well as its history. It's interesting, for a lot of people, even cradle Catholics, the history of the Catholic Church is an occasion of shame or embarrassment. It wasn't for me. I kind of found it intriguing, right? I found it very interesting and oftentimes inspiring. Um, when I was early studying those things, there were, as I say, there were multiple components, right, that kind of came together there. Certainly, people like Dante, like reading Dante's Inferno and Paradiso, right, as well as Purgatio. That was a really important part of coming to Catholic faith. So I just kind of, it was an immersion into a tradition. Interestingly enough, at the time moderately liberal Baptist college, but it was immersion into that tradition that was very compelling. As I kind of moved in that direction, Thomas came more and more to the fore, right? And as somebody who's a philosophy major, that's not surprising, even in a setting that wasn't particularly Catholic. If you're going to be interested in medieval and Catholic things, then Thomas is often going to come to the fore. And so, I mean, I kind of pivoted from Aristotle to Aquinas probably my senior year in college, and kind of never looked back. I had some good advice from some Dominican sisters. No surprise that they pointed me towards Thomas Aquinas, and also I ended up going to Catholic University of America on their recommendation because I could study Thomas Aquinas there. And so, and just like what Rich was saying, when you step into Thomas and and you start to feel the pull, right? I would say the pull of Thomas is synthesis and comprehension,
Uh-huh.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
you feel like, this kind of gets cheap, but it's just true still. Oftentimes in textbooks, they'll show you a picture of a cathedral or an architectural scheme of a cathedral, right? And kind of that is almost kind of a picture of Thomas's thought. And there's a way in which that is kind of compelling, right? It kind of hangs together, right? In a way that is very compelling and exciting, like you feel like there's that, I can't remember the name of it. There's this wonderful, I think maybe it's a lithograph or something, but it's an image that's from the late medieval period. It shows a man kind of emerging outside of this. It's a geocentric picture of the universe, coming outside of and kind of peeling back, right, the outer sphere of Earth and looking into, right, the stars and and everything around, right, and actually getting a sense of like reality, right.
Mhm.
That's kind of what, when you feel that tug of Thomas, I think that's kind of what he does for you. But I'll add to that, I think something that he does, that when he does that, if you go more than a superficial level, he does give you that sense of comprehension, but at the same time doesn't fall into the error of reducing Christian faith to philosophy. I think he recognizes the limits, right? And this is something that sometimes I find in engaging with students, they find a little aggravating, especially if they have any antagonism, right, to Christian faith. Is I'll say at some points, I'll say, well, Thomas won't tell you, which doesn't have a philosophical answer for what you're trying to, for the objection you're raising, because it has to do with the inner life of God. And he's going to say, reason can't go there, right? And that's not ad hoc on Thomas's part. He has an explanation for
Yeah, right. That's it.
right?
He has an explanation for why that is the case. Yeah.
You're right, exactly, right. And so it's a wonderful combination of ambition, philosophical ambition, right? There's a great intellectual kind of zeal, right, to Thomas to get as much as he can, but also a consistent way of recognizing the limits of reason as well. So I think that sense of balance and synthesis you find in Thomas has just been compelling and useful to me really throughout my life as a Catholic and also, as a scholar.
Yeah. So as being slightly younger than you, wise gentleman,
just slightly.
say that a little bit. Like my exposure to Thomas was, maybe some early books I picked up had his 5 proofs, but for the most part, he was fairly absent from. I mean, it was just, when at the time of my reversion and stuff, it was all John Paul II. That was, I mean, that he was the Pope at the time. He was Pope for what, 26 years. So, for the majority of my life, I knew one Pope, and that Pope wrote a lot, and people like to publish that Pope. So, for my own, getting into the Catholic faith, a lot of it was John Paul II, which then went into, or at least for me, went into Ratzinger, which, Ratzinger was huge in my life, particularly his ecclesiology, which was probably one of the number one areas of or subject areas that he, I think, really tried to progress theology on. So for, and for me, that idea and understanding of the church was huge, because there were many churches, right? There's all these other Christian denominations,
right.
And so in a very real way, I was trying to figure out, what is this thing that is the church? It's holy, but it's full of sinners. What the heck? Like, do I really need it then? It's full of a bunch of people like me. Like, why would I want more of that?
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So he played a huge part for me, and he's got tons of books on kind of his ecclesiology. There's even a huge, gigantic book by what's the guy's name? Helm, I think, Helm, who kind of put together all of Ratzinger's ecclesiology into one gigantic volume. but really coming to understand the church as the church's communion, right? There was a huge aspect for Ratzinger, that not only is it where I receive Holy Communion, but the church is this holy institution that is, the bride of Christ. And, how do we understand that? So, for me, it really, I came back into my Catholic faith through the thought of John Paul II, Cardinal Ratzinger. But I will say, just because this seems to be a podcast about Thomas Aquinas again, later on when I was studying theology and philosophy, Thomas did just in a very, I know he's dead and I was reading books, but in a calm way was just able to say, here are the reasons for, here is the answer to the question you ask. Very, very, he was calmly filling a lot of the holes that were there. And a lot of it was, I lacked a metaphysical understanding of the world, and kind of a metaphysical foundation to my theological thoughts. And so that was, that's kind of where I really started to dive into more philosophy. I added that as a minor in my undergrad, and decided to take metaphysics at 8:30 in the morning.
Nice.
Yeah, which
that is the best time.
Oh, it's a great way to wake up. 2 days a week, metaphysics,
coffee and metaphysics.
That's great. Yeah, that was a huge class for me, right? So really, just so many. It was one of those classes where you just have so many just aha moments,
Yeah.
and really starting to, and so in a very real way, I really came to faith. Began to believe in a very infantile way, and it was only later that I went back and to read Thomas, to study philosophy, and not just Thomas, but I mean there's so many others that I can mention there with the church fathers. Saint Anselm was huge, but also part of me, I'm thankful for God for that. I'm thankful to God for that. Because, I think in a very real way, I don't know if I would have appreciated some of these things had I studied it as kind of a half serious student in the very beginning, so, but, going back and finding those answers, filling those gaps, filling those holes, finding those philosophical foundations that were lacking. I understood what the church taught, but the full answer to why, or to the fullest extent we can understand, right, of why was lacking, and so he was huge in that, especially, and I was pointing particularly in the area of anthropology, right, the human person. Thomas, I think, is huge.
Yeah, sure.
With that, and I think that's also something that needs to be rediscovered and taught today, right? I think many of the world's problems can be solved with correct anthropology. So for me, that's kind of how it. But I would point especially to Ratzinger, and his emphasis on the liturgy as well. I think that's that made a huge impact on my study of theology. It really gave it a focus that was outside of simply like intellectual pleasure, right? But really put God as the object of my desire, my worship, and all of that.
So for me, Ratzinger was a huge influence because, one of the things that he does is he also has, like Thomas, I think, a very synthetic vision.
Yeah.
Right. Now he's not a systematic theologian. He doesn't do what Thomas does. Right. But I think if you get into his mind, you can see that in his mind, it all hangs together. There is a kind of, there's a picture that he's painting, and it's coherent. And it's got Christ at the center of it, right? As the culmination of humanity, right? This is what God was ultimately intending to do in making man. And so, I mean, it really is, And I like the fact that he, with Ratzinger, you know, he comes at today's problems as well. In this way, you know, Ratzinger is a little bit like some of the people that he himself admires, namely Augustine and Martin Luther. Ironically, you know, even though Luther's a Protestant heretic, but he's somebody that Ratzinger takes very seriously.
Mhm.
But both these figures, right, Augustine and Luther, really they can be described as occasional thinkers, right, in the sense that they respond to situations. Much of what they write, probably most of what they write, is actually sort of not armchair theology, but there's a situation in front of me, and here's me responding to it. Okay, and that's the way Ratzinger actually writes most of his stuff. Most of it is really that kind of thing. He's addressing issues. So, but one of the issues of today is the multiplicity of churches, as you pointed out, or the multiplicity of bodies of believers, divisions within the faith, and he wants to try to provide not only an account historically as to how that happened,
Mhm.
but also to pave a way forward to overcoming the problem. And I think he wants to also try to see where how can I put it? He wants to look at the question not only from the point of view of division or unity, right? But actually both. In what way are we united, and in what way are we divided?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
I think personally, I think that's very helpful. But
Yeah, and even as a catechist, I'll say Ratzinger had had a great influence as well, because many of the things he wrote about, he was answering modern objections, he was answering modern issues, and he wrote several things on catechesis as well. And like you said, he did a great job of really addressing kind of the some of the modern, even, you know, existential problems that modern man was facing with technology and things.
He starts Introduction to Christianity with the problem of belief.
Yeah.
Right. Like, how does someone believe? How does the modern man believe?
Yeah, he's got a great I think it was an essay or a speech he gave called handing on the faith in an age of disbelief, where, you know, he was keenly, you know, really just tapped into the modern culture. And the other thing for me with Ratzinger was that he was this weird kind of figure in kind of the history of the church, where, you know, for part of his life he was cast as the liberal, right? He was not a Thomist, which was crazy, that he was, you know, prefect for the CDF, right? And he wasn't a trained Thomist, right? That was very odd. And he was seen as like this liberal, but today he's this like ultra conservative dude. So I mean, even the perception of him, I find is fairly interesting in the history of the church. Yeah, there's a lot to be said with that one.
So one more thing I would say about Ratzinger, though, is as far as what makes me gravitate towards him, is he has this way, I think, of getting at the dogmatic center of a problem.
Sure.
And this is what I really, really find useful in Ratzinger. Even in the midst of a complete disaster, right? Even in the midst of, say, a problem, it's what seems to be an insoluble conundrum, where you have people on both sides of an issue, incompatible positions, arguing against each other.
Mm-hmm.
Ratzinger has this way of cutting, like with a knife, right, to the center of the dispute, and identifying there the thing that actually they're both trying to preserve.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So even in the midst of terrible controversies in the church, right, over the means of salvation, for example, between Protestants and Catholics, or within Catholicism, questions about providence and predestination, Ratzinger will he'll have this way of of identifying what each side is really sees as being at stake.
Yeah.
And he'll find that actually there's a point of confluence, that there's a baby in that bathwater, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the dogmatic center of the problem. And I think that is really, really to me, that's what makes him one of the great theologians of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think even for somebody, when you look at somebody like Thomas, right? Dr. Smith, like the Summa is Thomas answering other people's objections.
Sure.
He doesn't discount them. He doesn't say,
sure.
I am not going to answer this one because it's just stupid, or saying this one was given to me by somebody I don't like, like, and that's what I think.
I think in two places he does do that, and I think he was for Durandus, a medieval figure who thought that God was like the body of the universe, and he doesn't have a lot of time for it. But yeah, most of the time he's a pretty charitable interlocutor.
Yeah, and it reminds me of Joseph Pieper. Said that what makes St. Thomas a great teacher is that he has the ability to approach whatever subject it is that he's teaching from the point of view of the student.
I think actually that's when you're in college, that's one of the major appeals of Thomas.
Yeah,
right.
He takes you seriously.
Right. Yeah. I think that's true. Yeah, I think along those lines, of his many interlocutors, right? And I think he just sometimes providentially, he was kind of just in the right place at the right time and had the right instructors to kind of allow his mind to flourish, I think, to maybe its fullest degree for him. And one of those areas you see is in his kind of just very broad appreciation and engagement with the broader philosophical and theological tradition. So you see everybody from, pseudo Dionysius, right? Who wasn't necessarily thought of as pseudo up until Thomas's time, right? But have everything from pseudo Dionysius, who's very representative of a patristically Christianized Neoplatonism, right? Everything from that to Islamic philosophy in both its more skeptical elements, like in Averroes, or in its more orthodox and even mystical variants, like in Ibn Sina, engaging with the Jewish philosophical tradition, and certainly with the Greek, tradition as well. So, one of the things that's great about him, to me, as a Christian who does philosophy, is just the breadth of his engagement. I happen to be teaching medieval philosophy right now at a college, and it's like, I mean, you can imagine a conversation between him and Plato and Aristotle, right? Like it never happened. Obviously, they were vastly different guys in different places, but like the topics that engaged Thomas were the topics that engaged all of classical philosophy. And so in a way, he's not the only great thinker of that time period or of medieval philosophy, but he's just really great at kind of, if you study Thomas, you get an interaction with all of those different elements, all those different questions about universals, questions about the nature of change, questions about the forms and the immortality of the soul and the human person. I mean, all of that, right? I mean, because of the breadth of who he's engaged with, because he takes, that you get to kind of interact with the breadth of the philosophical tradition. As a professor, one of the things that has influenced me, and which maybe people who follow Thomas maybe kind of take this in different directions, but that actually influenced my pedagogy. Interestingly enough, right? That is, my own pedagogy is dialectical, and not, I don't know, monological. I don't know what would be the difference over there, but if you know what I mean, Rich, maybe you can speak to this. But like, I whenever I teach, like if I'm assigned to a philosophy of human person course, I certainly teach a big chunk, right, of straight Thomas, right? But I also like to bring in Plato and to bring in Marx and to bring in, Nietzsche and Albert Camus, or, other people that are the opposite really of Thomas, because that's the way actually Thomas works, right? He works dialectically. He engages in a literary form called the disputed question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Which, if you don't have anybody to dispute, doesn't work very well, right? But anyways, I know, Richard, you have any thoughts about
Well,
that?
I've used actually as an assignment
Mm-hmm.
the disputed question,
Right.
by which I mean I've posed a thesis
Mm-hmm.
and asked students to mount objections,
Mm-hmm.
right? Make and answer the objections,
Right.
make their argument, right? So, and I think it's very important. And what's shocking is how badly contemporary students tend to do on it. They simply, they don't,
Mhm.
their minds have not been trained
Sure.
to like genuinely entertain the other guy's point of view.
That's the hardest move. Yeah. Getting them to frame objections, and just trying to explain that like at the instructional level, like you're handing out the assignment, because I've done the same
I have
thing.
to argue for the position I don't agree with.
That's right. How do I do
But
that?
that's actually that's incomprehensible to some of these
That's
people.
right. You have to use your imagination. You have to use logic, That's
Again,
right.
this is one of the things that attracted me to Thomas when I was younger.
Mhm.
Is actually his willingness to, it's courageous, right?
Mhm.
His willingness to give the other side of the argument its best shot.
Sure.
And I remember even in college I would just cringe at the idea when people would describe they would describe you as closed-minded because you sort of had this confident position which you had derived from your study
Right.
of the great thinkers, including St. Thomas.
Mhm.
And I would just cringe at such an idea because in fact, there's no one more open-minded than the Catholic intellectual
Mhm.
in the scholastic tradition who engages in the disputed question.
Right.
I mean, that I can't, that is the most open-minded thing you could possibly do.
Sure. Right.
Yeah, and I think for, especially like if you read like the things that people are talking about in like, contemporary evangelization, they're like, okay, we need to build, trust, we need to ask questions, like everything. They're like, they're saying, here's what we need to do. So much of that was built into just education,
Mhm.
and serious education within kind of the Thomistic realm, or even just the classical
Mhm.
side of it, was to, yes, take the person's position seriously,
Mhm.
answer it without being condescending, right?
Right. Sure.
Answer, argue the position, not the person. I mean, there's so many different things that
Mhm.
we strive to do that were there before, and that we seem to have lost. But I think that points, that points back to one of the reasons why we started CSA, right?
Mhm.
To provide, to fill that educational gap where we can have a systematic study of theology and philosophy, and to be able to form the intellect, to not just assent to God, but also to you know uh, enter into the world and to answer the questions, whether we agree with the person or not. Because many times, you know uh, we have to be able to decipher, right, somebody's question, to see what it is that the place that they're coming from, right, to take it seriously and to address it lovingly, saying the church has an answer, right?
Mhm.
uh, um, uh, and here it is, right? It will answer your question. Whereas, sometimes people think of, systematic study as just, we're going to answer, we're going to give you all the answers to questions that nobody asks. No,
Yeah.
we're going to give you the answers that answer the deepest questions of the human
Mhm.
person. Now the problem
Or
comes in.
let me put it this way.
Yeah,
So sometimes there are questions people ask to which the church does not have an answer,
sure.
right? But I think what the church can provide in these cases is a couple of things. Number one, it can say, well, it's okay to have that question, but there's a way to ask it.
Yeah.
Right. So, so in other words, learning how to approach a question in the right frame of mind is, I think, very important in terms of remaining within the faith, right? So we can question ad extra from outside the faith. We can say, until I get an answer to this question is a blockade for my belief. If I don't have an answer to this question, I can't believe. Or we can ask a question ad intra, right? And we can say, well, this is a question. It's an important question. I don't know if I'll ever know the answer to it, but what I can see is possible directions for answers, right? And where I would have to go if one answer or the other were true. So that's an important thing, right? And the other thing I think that the church provides is, and this isn't just the church, but it's something the church gets from the scholastic tradition, namely the capacity to draw distinctions, right? So one of the things that the contemporary mind has largely lost the ability to do, in my view, is to distinguish between various nuances of an idea. And so you end up with all sorts of equivocation, right? When we talk about justice or love or something, we go down roads with these contemporary problems, right? That really, from a Christian point of view, you couldn't possibly go down. But the reason we go down those roads, even within the church, is that we've ceased to learn to distinguish. Right. So I think that needs to be recovered. And I think that one of the things that we offer at Catholic Studies Academy is training if in no other way that we try to do this ourselves. This is how we ourselves have been trained to draw distinctions. And so we show people what that looks like in a person's mind.
Yeah. And I think once you begin building that ordered intellect, and I'm speaking just from a lot of my own experience, is I think like Dr. Smith said, you begin to, when you interact with somebody who, somebody may be hostile to faith or just, maybe even indifferent to the faith, right? You begin to have that kind of that freedom for excellence, which, that freedom for being able to say, okay, let me ask this person a question, and really sort of, maybe a question that they've never asked, right? And so you can begin to enter into dialogue, and what that question does for that other person is it sparks that curiosity, right? So before you just give them an answer to a question they never asked, sometimes you have to give them that question. And it may take them a little while to entertain the curiosity of that question and what position that question presents. And then you can begin to dialogue and in that way. So I think it does, one of the things we try to do is, I think, really try to give people some freedom there to work within the boundaries, right, of the Catholic faith, but not in a restrictive way, but in a way that actually promotes freedom.
Sure.
All right, gentlemen, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. Any final thoughts on our 100th episode?
I'll just follow up, I guess, a little bit on what Rich said there. That I think one of the things that Catholic Studies Academy has to offer to folks, and I hope that this comes across in our podcast and in our short videos that we have on YouTube. Rich has done a lot of those that are really great. Also, in our blog post, that is kind of just trying to exemplify what the Catholic intellectual life looks like right? You know, it's not that you have to necessarily be a Thomist, although I think you should, but nevertheless, it's not that you have to be a Thomist or a Ratzingerian or I don't know whatever that is exactly, but it's that, you know, these are good examples, right, of what it looks like to be a Christian who has faith, engaging intellectually, looking for further answers, you know, following that Anselmian, you know, faith-seeking understanding kind of approach. And that, you know, Thomas and Ratzinger and Anselm and Augustine and, you know, the people we've talked about are great examples of that. And I think the three of us, you know, are trying to be examples of that, kind of reaching up to them as examples that we can follow. And so I just encourage people to engage in it in that way, you know, to engage in the courses and the podcast. And we had our first live seminar not too long ago. That was a lot of fun, you know, to engage in the seminars in that way, right? You know, view CSA as a resource, you know, that gives you examples, gives you insights, gives you resources and content for your own, you know, life as a Christian and as a Catholic intellectual.
Yeah, great point. I mean, you know, you think about all the great witnesses that went before us, right? What's one thing they all had in common? Well, they all had guides before them, right?
Sure, right.
Augustine had Ambrose, Thomas had Albert, right? So something that we can imitate. While we won't be able to necessarily imitate the intellect of Aquinas, Aquinas had guides, right? And so that's also what we want to provide. Dr. Bulzacchelli, any final thoughts?
Well, for me, you know, there's a certain, I think what I want to kind of show, right, is that we should have minds as broad as the church is, and that those minds should be trained to think within the faith, and to do so in a way that engages the world. I don't mean the world, capital W world, right? But I mean is the natural world that engages natural reason, and so there should be a confidence in inquiry within the faith, right? Then I try to model that, and I try to show people how to do that, how to think that way.
Very good. And
I think that's what we're all trying to do.
Absolutely. And I think I'll point our listeners, for me, I'll point you to Catechism paragraph 157, right? Faith is certain. That one of the things I hope to do in, you know, catechesis, and what I always try to do is to give people a confidence, right, in their faith, to understand the certainty of it, right? That like it says, you know, the certainty of the divine light, right? It shines on there, and, you know, 10,000 difficulties do not make for one doubt. That we can have a certainty to our faith, and we should be proud of that and able to stand on it. And, you know, like it says in Scripture, to be able to give a reason for the hope that is within us.
Right. To circle back to the beginning, right? That there, it matters. Having faith matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because
and just to encourage all of our listeners, seek that understanding that faith begins, right? Keep trying to learn as hard as it can be, with all the voices that are constantly vying for our attention. Keep seeking that understanding. And so I want to thank all of our listeners for all the support you've given us as we've reached this milestone of 100 episodes of Take Every Thought Captive. Just thank you for everything, and we hope that you continue to be able to use our information for your own benefit. And until next time, God bless.